Can you say, "This is Dr. Amanda Zelahusky"?
Why do we have to?
Just try it.
Oh, I can't.
Deep breath. Okay.
This is Dr. Amanda Zelahusky. Lindsay Malloy. Ah!
Now, wait, say Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
No, come back.
This is Dr. Lindsay Malloy. Welcome to the Parenting Podcast.
One more time.
And then after that, can we have a candy after it?
No.
Please, Mommy.
Okay, ready?
Pandemic Parenting Podcast.
Excellent. Welcome to the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. I'm Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
And I'm Dr. Amanda Zelahusky. We are two psychologists, scholars, and moms, and together we are the co-founders of Pandemic Parenting.
We're here to share science-based research and help all who care for kids navigate this challenging time together.
In this episode, we're discussing fear and anxiety in children of all ages. This might be our number one requested topic. So many of us have seen increased fear and anxiety in our children during this pandemic, and we're worried about how our own fear and anxiety might be impacting our kids and vice versa. What I think was particularly great about this conversation is that much of the advice shared by our guest experts applies beyond the pandemic in lots of different contexts, and that anxiety is one of the most common issues in kids. So I think the advice they shared will be really helpful.
Absolutely. So joining us for this conversation were Dr. Jill Ehrenreich-May and Dr. Donna Pincus, who are both clinical psychologists and experts in child and adolescent anxiety. You can learn more about their backgrounds on our website and in the show notes. I know I learned a lot from them, and I hope you get a lot out of the conversation too. All right, let's get into it. Well, thank you so much for being here today with us to talk about child and youth fear and anxiety. Really excited to have Jill and Donna with us, in part because they are renowned experts in these areas, but also because we've been working together now for just over a year on our project that's all, I guess, sort of broadly on how to talk to kids about COVID-19, how parents are talking to kids about COVID-19 and how that's affecting their adjustment. So that is something, again, we've been working on for over a year. We're really excited to get some findings out there, hopefully soon. But first, I guess let's start off by talking about fear and anxiety in kids and teens in general, if that's okay. And then we can move on to talking more specifically about in the context of COVID-19. So in general, what does anxiety look like in kids, and does it look different at different ages?
So we know that anxiety is actually a very natural human emotion. And so we don't really want to take away all anxiety. And it's just as natural as being sad or being happy. And for many kids, though, they experience anxiety, and some actually even like the feeling, or some recognize that having some anxiety can help you perform better on things. However, I think that for many kids who experience anxiety that is out of bounds to the situation, it starts to interfere in them being able to do things that are fun, or they do them, but they're not having fun while they're doing them. So, I think it's an emotion that can become overwhelming, and it's hard at times to really articulate what they're feeling. And as a result, they may begin avoiding many things in life. And it's usually the very things that we'd expect at developmental stages that we would hope that kids would be involved in. Like young kids might avoid things like going on sleepovers, or avoid going to camp because there may be bugs there, or avoid getting a shot at the doctor's office. Whereas like older kids might avoid going back to school, like they've all been gradually doing most recently, because maybe there's things about school that are anxiety provoking. So we do see a developmental progression. I think it's interesting to see across cultures even. You see some very similar kinds of progressions of fear across developmental stages. And many of the things we're afraid of, it's adaptive to be afraid of. So like loud noises or strangers when you're little, it's not adaptive to just kind of go with anybody. And then at different ages, it's adaptive to be maybe afraid of, situations that feel like, maybe that there could be danger involved or other things. So things where you perceive threat. So we know that gradually across the ages, gradually fears become a bit more abstract, and they kind of follow cognitive development. So we do see a general progression in the types of fears that kids experience at different stages. So for example, young kids are more likely to have separation anxiety, but adolescents may be more likely to have something like panic disorder.
Can we just unpack some of these terms? So like fear versus anxiety versus worry. Can you help us understand what each of those terms mean? Because I think we mix them up a lot.
So fear is really having to do with what's going on in the here and now, in the present moment, right? So I'm having a fear of something that I'm either imagining is happening right now, or I'm in the context of something happening right now. Anxiety is really characterized in a way by anticipation or worry about something that, oftentimes may be happening in the future, or that you think might be happening in the future. We can kind of, think about the timing of the stressor or the threat between the two. Anxiety tends to be a little more cognitive, if you will, or, it's really all about what you're thinking is going to happen. When somebody's having a fear reaction in the moment, their behavior can be very dysregulated, or can be very reactive to, again, what they feel like is a danger in the present moment.
So thinking about that, then, there's normal anxiety like Donna was talking about. There are things that it's healthy for us to feel anxious about. That's adaptive, like you said. But I'm wondering, what are some signs that our child might have reached like concerning levels of fear or anxiety? So where is that line?
We really look at a couple of different aspects of someone's behavior, because as Donna indicated, it is really normal to feel fearful and anxious during development. And, oftentimes, the fears that children have, early on, are somewhat transient and kind of pass over time to anxieties maybe a bit more stable. People who are kind of high worriers sort of tend to remain high worriers, if you will, over time. But the things that we look at are frequency, how often is it happening? Is it happening every time you go to gymnastics, or maybe just that one time? Persistence, right? It's continuing to happen. Even beyond the point at which it would be kind of typical developmentally. Donna mentioned, for example, separation anxiety is really typical early in development, but if it's persisting into older ages where it would normally have decreased, that would be something that we would look at. Intensity, are they having like a huge reaction to these things, or a very small reaction? That can be a little deceptive sometimes, because some people who are anxious have a very internalized or experience. You don't sort of see it, obviously, but it's maybe having impact in other ways in school and peer relationships, and in terms of what they're willing to do, versus avoid. And yeah, I think those are the main things that we look at in terms of, when we might be concerned enough to say, oh, maybe I should, talk to somebody about this or evaluate it a little bit further.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything Jill said. And also, anxiety can also be very physical too. Kids have somatic complaints, just building on that, like, stomach aches, a headache, I feel nauseous, I'm not sure if I might be sick. There's always that possibility, kind of questions like that. So it's not uncommon for kids to wind up at the school nurse's office when they have anxiety. And in fact, like, they are really experiencing some physical sensations. It's just they're not indicative of like illness. It's more just the fight or flight system. So another marker parents might look for, like frequent complaints, frequent stomach aches, frequent headaches. That's another difficulty sleeping, falling asleep, lots of worries on the mind, all of those things.
Seeking reassurance too from
yes.
from parents and caregivers that, we have kids who check a lot of times per day about whether or not this thing they're worrying about is going to happen, and it becomes interfering to the parent, or it becomes interfering to the teacher to get through the day.
I think a lot about that with, like you were talking about, the somatic pieces of it, both of you, like with stomach aches, right? Like, kids don't have the language to, or sometimes they can't tell between what feels like butterflies or nervous feelings in my stomach versus a stomach ache because I ate too much candy. And they just know that they feel something. And so I do think that's why it's so confusing. And kids a lot of times will say, I have a stomach ache, but it's just what you or I might talk about is like, oh, my stomach's in knots because I'm so nervous, but I can tell the difference between that and an actual stomach ache. And so,
Butterflies.
Yeah.
Butterflies. Yeah. I think it was Donna was talking about interfering, or was that you, Jill? I can't remember, about interfering with the parent. And I just made me think, like, are there times when there are kids who don't really see their anxiety as a problem, who might even like some aspects of it, but maybe it's the parent who is struggling with some of these things? Like, do you see that in your in your research or practice?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be tough, because to maybe try to convince them that it is a problem or that it is something worth seeking treatment for. I suppose it depends on their age largely there, but.
They talk about, when we're asking people about their symptoms, something called the actor-observer phenomena. When we ask parents, oftentimes what their child is experiencing, they're going to attribute it to the child. The child's having anxiety, they're having symptoms in their body. And a lot of times the child is going to attribute it to the situation. I find that school is prompting this, or this other situation is making me feel this way. And so, because of that, and also because of factors related sometimes to the child's age and cognitive development, sometimes they just can't put words to the experience just yet, especially our kids under 7. And that can lead to some of that difficulty that kids have in sort of really accurately identifying what they're experiencing related to anxiety.
So what about parents in terms of their own anxiety? How important is that in terms of possibly, transmitting our fears or anxieties to our kids, and whether our children develop significant fear or anxiety?
I think, many behaviors that I like to use the word inadvertent, because we don't mean to cause our children more anxiety. But, if you inadvertently react in a way where maybe you're overreacting to a situation, or your own anxiety about it is getting in the way. Kids feed off of, they watch us more than we recognize sometimes, I think, and then can get information, and they're watching us to get information about what is safe and what's not, what is a level of threat they should be paying attention to. And so remembering that modeling is one way that kids can acquire fears or different anxieties. And even, behaviors like excessively reassuring someone. Have you got your phone? You know who you call if you have issues, right? And, here you're on the way to camp, and suddenly the child's starting to doubt whether or not they think they can do it. Or even a behavior like answering a lot of worry questions. Like, we did have one child one time he's like the policeman of the house. He would ask lots and lots of questions. And every time his parent answered the worry question, it was just reinforced, and the worry questions continued. It wasn't distressing at all for him. He says, I just have lots of questions. But to his parents, they found it to be very distressing to be constantly asked these questions. So,
Donna, are you inside my house? What is going on? I feel attacked. No, I'm just kidding. But I think it's just interesting. I was thinking about what you're saying with the reassurance and parents providing that, but the kids not seeing it as problematic, maybe. And when we think about, especially in this pandemic, there are many things we've had to remind our kids about, or it is our anxiety. So we're saying, don't forget to do this, go wash your hands, don't forget, and yeah, when there's uncertainty and we're settling some of our own anxiety, I see that kind of butting up against kids' reassurance seeking when we don't have answers either for the kinds of things they're seeking reassurance about. And so, yeah, it's just something to be mindful of. I haven't always realized until others have pointed it out. Do you realize how many times your child has asked this question again and again? Or, what you were just saying, modeling that, if I have another child who actually is pretty forgetful and I do need to tell him again and again to do things, are the other kids hearing that? And then, like you said, I'm modeling this, repetitive sort of checking.
And when we do therapy with children who are having anxiety, a lot of times we're working very directly with the parent to kind of monitor and pay attention to their own emotions when they see their child distressed, either, and again, during the pandemic, and maybe for a lot of very understandable reasons. But, when we're feeling anxious as parents, we're not going to be super logical. We're not going to, we're not going to be able to kind of think through, it isn't very likely that they would experience, a problem in this situation. We just see that our child's upset, and the more upset we become, the more likely it is that we're going to say, forget it, right? We'll do this another day. We'll try this again some other time. And, like Donna was suggesting, it really just ends up kind of sending this message that was probably a dangerous situation, or that was probably something that we really did need to avoid. And so paying really good attention to how you are feeling as a parent when these things are anxiety provoking for your child, is really quite crucial to, getting them through effective therapy.
It's so hard though. I've always been that parent who, they tell you, if your kid falls down when they're learning how to walk or whatever, you should act calm because then they'll be calm about it. And I have always been, and I still am to this day, even though they're almost 4 and 6, the parents, when something happens, and my husband will even look at me like, come on, like you're adding so much to this. And that checking back behavior that they do, I'm definitely not sending probably the best signals in that regard. So
It's a lot.
You have to
worse.
forgive yourself too, because it's natural, to just that mama bear comes out, and we're hardwired maybe also to protect at all costs. And you see a child gets hurt, so of course you kind of shriek because that's causing your alarm system to kind of activate.
yes, no, thank you for that.
I was just reading an article recently that was talking about how much parents have the tendency, like if you picture your kid on the playground, right? They're swinging from the jungle gym or whatever, and it's our instinct to say, be careful, hey, be careful. And the article was just talking about how, like, number one, you don't need to say that. That is to reassure yourself that you're, I don't know, being a good parent because you're reminding your kid to be careful, but it's more around building trust in them. So it might be, I think, saying things like, hey, I trust that you're gonna, be careful out there, or if it feels dangerous or feels scary, let me know. But you're trying to empower your child to make those risk decisions instead of this constant reminder to be careful. It was sort of reminding me of when we tell kids when they're really upset, calm down, like, really, does that work when somebody says that to you when you're upset? So I don't know what that's about. Like our need to constantly say, be careful.
Oh my gosh, I've done that. I just, yeah, I'm thinking of all the things that I need to work on as we're having this discussion, but just reminded me that when my older child was about 3 and the younger one was 1, he used to keep telling her, no, don't do that. It's dangerous. Like, and I was like, maybe this isn't good and I should tone it down a little bit when you've got the 3-year-old saying that everything is dangerous. So yeah, definitely learning.
I think to a certain extent, though, you really have to give yourself a little bit of grace, right? You may be a person who is, hyper vigilant a little bit for what's going on with your child at the playground. And you might not find that you always say the most empowering and effective thing in the moment. But, I think that in reality, just noticing that you feel that way is kind of the first step, like noticing that you want to say, be careful, being mindful, as a parent of what my emotion is telling me can also give us a cue to, give them a little bit more autonomy and say, okay, that's a reminder to me that they need a little bit of space here. And I'm going to go whisper to myself here in the corner of the
That's
playground.
a great strategy. And I know you both have multiple kids as well. We all have more than one child here. And I think too, just being mindful of the type of kid that you have and remembering that. So, maybe my younger one could use those reminders, but my older one doesn't really need them. And so if I'm giving those reminders with him and with his temperament, maybe that's just not necessary and it's going to overdo it and it's actually going to make him feel unnecessarily anxious.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's making me think about, right, this dynamic between the parent's anxiety perhaps and the child's, and how those can kind of go back and forth cyclically. Like I was thinking about what you just said, Jill, that maybe you're a more hypervigilant parent. And I was listening to that thinking, like, I was a fearless kid. I was the one swinging all over the place. Like, why now am I the parent on the playground saying, oh gosh, be careful, don't go so high. What are you doing? Like, it made me so unfun. So I was just sort of thinking about that. And Donna, I wanted to ask you, like, what are other things that we as parents do that actually makes our kids' anxiety or fear maybe worse? Like, what are some of these other things we need to be mindful of, like Jill was saying?
Well, I think communicating, maybe making sure in those situations that you're talking about where you're like, be careful, like maybe it's remembering, hey, is what I'm saying helpful, or am I maybe taking away from just immersing in the experience? Like, how likely is it really that there's going to be like something really bad happening? Maybe using some of the techniques we teach them, just using them for a moment and just being more mindful of, even as a psychologist or researcher, we code behaviors, code our utterances, and sometimes you become more aware of like, what am I saying? But without being too critical, of yourself also. But then, also engaging kids, sometimes letting them hear that, we're not perfect either. And we can have moments where we are sad. We can have moments where we're feeling scared, and maybe just actually saying them out loud. Like, I'm feeling a little worried about this right now, but I know what I can do. Number one, I know this, and I'm like, like they can hear you talk it through maybe for yourself. And that's kind of the self-talk we want them to be able to engage in. So maybe it is not necessarily hiding our emotions or having to expect ourselves to be these perfect people, because who is that? There's not one parent, even with all the skills that we know as child psychologists, there's no way that I would say, I feel perfect at every utterance I make as a parent. And so we don't want our kids to think they have to, that they have to build up to that. So, and maybe it's also remembering to have fun with your kids and to not worry so much. Just letting go a little bit more.
At Pandemic Parenting, we're committed to sharing our expertise and research in ways that are immediately accessible and useful to families. As part of our efforts to sustain and expand this work, Lindsay and I are also available for virtual speaking engagements at your business, organization, PTO, and more. We want to help you and those who you work with, grow with, and raise your children with have the chance to do so in an environment that fosters and supports your mental health. Some of the topics we enjoy speaking on include parenting during the pandemic, the impact of trauma on children and families, children's development, the mental health impact of COVID-19 on employees, and more. If you or your organization are interested in potentially collaborating, please reach out to us for availability and pricing through the Request a Speaker form on our website at www.pandemic-parent.org/contact.
So I just had one follow-up question before we change gears, I guess, related to some of the examples you're giving. So just in how sometimes what we're seeing in our kids is anxiety, but we don't know that it's that in the ways that it's showing up. So you talked about stomach aches, for example, but I was kind of also thinking about the other extremes. Like Lindsay and I work a lot in juvenile justice spaces where, we see lots of disruptive behaviors from kids, really serious behaviors. And so I was wondering if you could talk about how, what are some other examples of behavior, like really disruptive behaviors your kids might be showing that are actually anxiety underneath them, even though that's not what you would guess is going on?
The first thing that comes to mind when you say that is irritability. There's actually been research during the pandemic that irritability has been kind of skyrocketing, especially during quarantine periods. Kind of makes sense. Everybody's sort of stuck in places together. If you think about when you are experiencing a lot of worry as an adult, at least for me, if I'm worried about some task that I'm doing and then somebody else, kind of drops in and asks me something, sometimes something kind of innocuous, like I might snap at them, or I might sort of, say something in a way that really wasn't the nicest way that I could have possibly said it. So this is mostly my problem that I'm talking about here.
I'm with you.
But I think that there are a lot of our kids who, especially in the middle school years, where they're expressing in some ways some of the chronic worry or sleep problems related to the chronic worry that they're having in terms of being kind of irritable and more difficult in the way that they're managing things. They may seem a little hopeless or kind of like they, don't know if they can manage things, and so might start showing kind of what looks a little bit more like depression type symptoms over time. So sometimes we see some of those things happening. I think that there is a lot of overlap between, some of the disruptive behaviors and some of the more internalizing or anxiety related behaviors that we see in younger kids sometimes too. But, it can vary in terms of how much, that's making the problems worse. But we certainly see kids at times behaving in a very, what they call oppositional way when they're anxious about something. It can really confuse parents because suddenly somebody's just refusing to go somewhere or do something or follow a direction. And it's actually because they're feeling very anxious about it. It makes it really confusing in terms of what to do as a parent then too, because you might be feeling for them. I see that they're nervous, but they're also being super difficult right now.
I feel like you've just described my 3-year-old to a T right now.
Be normal at 3.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And most teenagers, like you're saying, I just think about how, parents will sometimes experience that exactly as you said, oppositional or this kid just bit my head off. All I did was ask you to pick up your socks, or get ready. We have to leave for school. And we don't realize that they're just sort of tormented underneath with whatever it is they're worried about, but it's not coming out that way. So it's hard for us to have empathy because it's whoa, what is your problem?
Yeah.
There still have to be limits, right? You still have to set limits in those circumstances, even if it is coming from, a more anxiety related.
We've seen more tantrums too in young kids. So tantrums is another example of a behavior that could be anxiety, even though initially it might seem like someone's just being oppositional. But, if you think about a tantrum, if done at the right time, it could actually help you avoid something. So I had one example of a parent I saw, I had taken my own child to a dance class, And the parent really wanted her daughter to engage in the ballet class. And the child started, was really reticent to do it. And the parent said, come on, we paid for this. Your dad worked an extra job to get money for this, like all kinds of things to, filter into it, other things. Then it turned to bribing. And I was just sort of like silently observing in my head. We've all been there of like, you want your kid to do something and they're not doing it, how frustrating that can be. And then eventually it was like, well, you know what? I did buy you some amazing chocolate chip muffins and they're in the car. If you do it, you'll get that. It's returned to bribing. And then at the very end, it was like the daughter had a tantrum and she was just very frustrated. And I saw that week after week tantrums right beforehand. And I think that was functioning to, as avoidance of the situation. So here, I think tantrums can have very many different functions. And we see that sometimes it can be, even though seems like oppositionality could be also anxiety.
Yeah, which then gets reinforced. But Donna, it sounds like you're saying that bribery is not a good parenting tool. I'm going to need to unpack that a lot.
I say rewards, though the well-timed rewards, if we could say that way.
Especially if they're not doing it already, right? Like you want to increase the behavior you want to see more of.
Right. And praise, good parenting tools. So it depends on how we think about rewards, and not necessarily like, if you do this, I'll give you the cupcake, but not if you don't, like it's something where you're exerting control. And I think the difference with rewards, the child is really in control. They kind of know that it's up to them to engage in the behavior, then they'll get the reward. But if you're then making it that you're completely in control of that I'm not giving it to you, then suddenly it may just foster more anxiety, I guess.
Yeah. And that's like, it reminds me of that persistent kind of school refusal cycle then, where it's what you're describing, sort of the tantrum or whatever the problem behavior is, it's just getting reinforced because you have a child who's super anxious about going to school. So they go there and they act out so that the parent gets called and has to pick them up and they've achieved, sort of the goal, but we're missing what's actually going on because it's like, oh, well, this is just a child who's acting out at school. Like, so then it gets reinforced. Yeah.
Yeah. Or kids who just skip class. They wind up going to the bathroom. They wind up going somewhere else. And the teachers are labeling them as oppositional or like defiant in some way but yet maybe, and Jill and I have experienced this in our clinical work for sure, like they're just avoiding math class because they have panic in math. And no one could know that just by looking at them. All they see is the behavior of avoidance. But really what you have is like a struggle that they're going through.
That's
and they haven't verbalized to anyone. So.
Or lazy. Sometimes they're labeled as lazy, right? Blowing it off, don't care, apathetic. And it's like sometimes apathy, I think, is another one that can mask anxiety actually going on.
I love the examples of the dance class. And I know that must be so hard for you to sit there, like knowing all these potential strategies and not being able to jump in. But I'm wondering if we can talk about the clinical work and research that you both have been doing during the last year, and how COVID has impacted kids and families in terms of anxiety and fear, and what are the big fears and anxieties that you're seeing in kids and parents right now?
We've been seeing a lot of everything. Let me just start by saying that I think that we are seeing more fear, more anxiety, more worry, more sadness, more irritability. It is across the board more. And I think that that's kind of like the bottom line of it to a certain extent. I think related to COVID, it can be quite variable. We certainly have kids who have family members who have health risks, or they themselves have health risks, and they're, quite worried about being in spaces that, all of us have concerns about, in terms of possibly, infecting themselves or infecting a family member. Increasingly, what we see a lot of is the challenges related to the extended periods of social distancing and the consequences. If you think about it, we've been talking all about avoidance and how that is the action that you want to take when you're feeling fearful and anxious. And to a certain extent, we've all been en masse avoiding and escaping for the last year plus. So for people who were already anxious, Let's say I was socially anxious, about being around other people. Well, this was like just a dream, that I got to be away from, people and all the things that were difficult for me for a really long time. So now trying to think about how to reintegrate, particularly for people who struggled, with it before or have struggled with it during, we're seeing quite a lot of that in the presentation of the kids that we're working with.
Yeah, I think for kids who were afraid of, needles before, now that we're seeing a resurgence of kids who are coming in, like they're afraid of getting a vaccine. So even being 16 or something, where they had avoided this effectively, or, got only the necessary shots and now realizing they have to face it again. Or kids who were afraid of germs for a while there, then during the situation where they were like then being told like everywhere there could be a germ that's dangerous to you. It could be floating in the air. You don't know where it is and you can't see it. That's like, this general alarm where I think those kids felt more anxious. And interestingly, some of the things that I think that, we might have seen too, that many kids might, experience like just, intense, just feelings of anxiety because, they were isolated, and some kids felt like a little bit better. Like they felt like, wow, this pandemic allowed me to not have to go to school. And that's what I was most excited about. It allowed me to do, and that's what I didn't like school because like, there's some things about school that were difficult, or maybe, I'm afraid of a particular teacher and I didn't like a particular class. And now look at this, everybody's online. I can even put up my hoodie and not have to talk during breakout rooms, which is what I hear. Many of the teenagers just do not talk during breakout rooms. And that it's possible to avoid in all sorts of ways that weren't possible before.
Well, and when I think about, all right, so these are all sort of legitimate things you're describing that, people were anxious about or conditioned to be anxious about, throughout the pandemic. And now, we're starting to get a lot of questions from parents around, as people get vaccinated, as we start to get back to whatever normal is going to look like on the other side of this, how do we uncondition all these things we've conditioned our kids and ourselves to be afraid of or avoidant of? And I think related to that, I've been seeing some headlines around in areas where, the vaccination rate is pretty high. Well, people are still having irrational fear about, getting back to life. And it's like, how is that irrational when we've told you for over a year to be afraid of these things? So I just wondered your thoughts about kind of, as life returns, again, in whatever form, what are those anxieties going to look like, and how can we help parents and kids with those?
If you are seeing or knowing that your child is very reluctant about going into spaces that you have deemed safe or you believe are safe, or they're vocalizing a lot of anxiety about those kind of situations, I would say first just start with empathy and understanding, right? It's completely understandable why people might be feeling this way during this time. It's understandable, why this might seem overwhelming to you. Allowing just first the conversation to happen that I see you, I understand, I think can lead to, all right, what can we do that will feel reasonably safe as a starting point? I big believer in exposure therapy. And, I think that sometimes you have to negotiate a little bit where you start, right? Maybe the child doesn't feel comfortable yet to be in a grocery store or to be, in an enclosed movie theater or something along those lines, but might feel comfortable to go to a park with one friend and maybe eventually sitting, in a library for 1 minute or 2 minutes, and then coming back out. So what we want to do is kind of think about what are like baby steps along the way that will help us get back to, again, within a sort of a reasonable, safe space, a more normalized level of social interaction.
Yeah, it's hard because we've been out of practice. And I also think there's some things that are going to be new situations that kids are navigating. And I have 3 kids and they're all in either middle school or high school. And now I'm learning that when they go back to the lunchroom, it looks very different than what a lunchroom used to be. It used to be you talked at lunch and you had to navigate the social scene. Well, now there's rows of, at least in our school, and rows of chairs, at least 3 feet apart. You get an assigned seat, you eat facing forward. You don't know if you're going to be placed next to a friend. You can't choose where you sit. So there's like a little bit less control in that way. Harder to read people's facial expressions because the kids are all masked. So there's some differences in what they're navigating in terms of their social interactions. So I think it's changed that the things that they're having to face on a daily basis might be a little different. So we might see types of anxieties that we hadn't seen necessarily before.
Yeah, I was talking with somebody recently who was sharing the example of, her daughter's in middle school and it's been completely remote learning. And so, like you were talking about, kids have their cameras off, you're not really seeing everybody as much. And so she went back for some sort of orientation, something, and she came home and said, Mom, these boys from last year, they're like men. They have facial hair. It was like puberty happened to her peers while she's been home on a Zoom screen. And it was really distressing to her. I was in school with boys a year ago and now they are men. And I just thought, wow, like how different to navigate.
Yeah, the passage of time has just kind of, we maybe felt we were all doing something similar during that time, but we didn't get the snippets of being able to see anyone to see those changes over time. Yeah.
Just to add a slightly different perspective, because I'm in Florida and my children have been back in school since October of 2020. But I think that one thing that I have noticed, it is weird, it is different, but I have been really impressed with how resilient and how able to kind of take on these new routines our kids have been. My kids are way better and more compliant with things like mask usage, social distancing, and other things. We were at a park and my daughter was riding a bike with me. And I said, you don't have to wear your mask while you're biking. Like, it's okay because you're moving. And she's like, no, there are a lot of people around. So, I think it's more appropriate for me to keep my mask.
100%.
7-year-old.
100%. The kids are so much better at this than the grown-ups.
Yeah.
My daughter today had saxophone. She plays saxophone in the band. Well, now band is outside with bell covers on everything, and you're in a tent playing outside where there's a whole neighborhood there, and all the sixth graders are out there playing in the band. So that's a different level where you might feel a little self-conscious about playing, where that's a new situation we hadn't had to navigate before. So I just add that.
Yeah, but I do love thinking about and just pointing out how resilient they can be, and arguably more adaptable than we are in many ways. But I just was thinking too about, and this might sound kind of irrational, but I'm talking to anxiety experts, so that's fine, right? But I sometimes feel this way, and I hear from other parents too about the long-term effects of this, which obviously we don't know yet, but that's what a lot of people want to know about. How have we changed the course of development for our kids by, for example, making them suspicious of other people? I definitely feel that when I'm out, I have young kids, so I have to really remind them, okay, stay back, stay 6 feet back, and things like that. And I know a lot of parents who are talking about what that means long-term. And I liked that, I can't remember which one of you used the word sort of unconditioning our kids to these things, but I get the sense that what you're saying is that this is possible, that we can get them back to normal, whatever normal might look like, that we haven't sort of caused them to forever be suspicious of other people, for example.
Yeah, I think that we have to remember that a lot of things are developmentally going to happen in similar ways as they would have happened before. Maybe things were a little delayed. Maybe, your kindergartner didn't start in-person kindergarten, at the time that you had expected. And they're still going to have to go through transitions related to separating from you there and getting used to the structure and getting used to, again, in these odd circumstances, but they will get used to it. It just may be a little bit longer or a little bit delayed. And I agree with you completely, Lindsay. It is weird out there, right? It feels weird. It feels odd. Anytime anybody does something unexpected, you're like, wait, so we all have kind of, conditioned ourselves almost to have panic-like responses.
Like the vigilance, the constant vigilance of the environment. Yeah.
It's going to take a while, for that to lessen, but, that should lessen as feelings of safety increase, right? So, and for some people, that's going to take even longer because they are very kind of hypervigilant or worried by nature. And it's going to take them a longer time to sort of sense that there's safety. But you as a parent can reinforce that, right? You can say, all right, I think it's safe because of X, or, I see that this is happening, and so we're going to move over there. Whatever it might be, so that you can make the world that feels pretty unpredictable still a little bit more predictable.
I think also just the mismatch that now we have adults that are vaccinated, but kids aren't.
Yes.
Adults might not be wearing masks now because in all different states, I know it's a little bit different in terms of the rules, but now adults don't need to wear masks outside, but then kids aren't yet protected. So how do you say, you're not sending a consistent message? At least before it was like, well, we all are masked. And my little 4-year-old niece said, oh yeah, we wear masks because there's a germ and we got to keep ourselves protected from this germ. And okay, yeah, you're right. I wear the mask to protect you from the germ, and you do the same thing for me. But now it's like, wait, why is she not caring about me? And she's not wearing. Why are you not wearing a mask? And so I think we're in different territory now where we're having to explain things that might be harder to understand. And we've all been learning together throughout this.
Well, you could come to Canada where the vaccine rollout is so slow that we're all still wearing masks. So yeah. Well, funny story, like when you brought up the fear of needles that's resurfacing, that's so fascinating because I wouldn't have necessarily predicted that. But I guess, yeah, kids and teens are hearing about shots all the time now, like hearing about vaccines. My kids were so excited about the vaccine for like a year because I kept telling them about these people, these amazing scientists who were creating this vaccine that was going to get us out of this situation, the virus, we would get back to normal eventually. And then they found out that a vaccine was a shot, which they didn't realize before. So they were all excited about it. And then they're like, hold on, wait a second. What? Like it's a shot? Oh no, I'm not interested in that. They're quite scared of them. So maybe by then they could get like a kid version that's a
gummy. It's
a
like
delicious syrup or gummy
snacks.
or something.
Right.
They got to get working on that.
Exactly.
Although one of my grad students who's doing her dissertation is on like an online, using telehealth, treating kids for fears of shots, actually. So it's pretty, where she's mailing them little packets and doing gradual exposure. She's going to, do that with the kids in like a 1-session treatment.
What
Yeah,
a great idea.
Yeah. I'm glad
awesome.
you brought up treatment on it because that's exactly what I wanted to ask next is, we've been talking about kids can be very adaptable and resilient, and they can, but there are also kids really, really struggling right now. And so I'm just wondering if you both can sort of speak to like, how as a parent can I tell if it's time to get help for my child? And if it is, what kinds of treatments are out there? Like, just give me a little insight into, how we can fix this or how I can tell if I need to take steps like that.
Well, usually we start with some of the things we started the conversation with, like we talked about interference in developmentally appropriate activities, distress, like your kids doing something, but they don't look like they're having fun doing it. Everyone's else is outside at the bonfire, and having fun, roasting marshmallows and doing things, but your child isn't having fun, or it looks like they're just marking time before they leave. The somatic complaints, the frequent headaches, the frequent stomach aches, the avoidance of situations, maybe some tantruming, maybe irritability or sadness. I mean, these are all like constellations of different feelings that kids feel in sometimes very intense ways, where you can tell when your child is just not enjoying the things that most kids seem to be enjoying. So those are some markers. And thankfully, there are, I'd say over the last few decades, there's been a surge in research on anxiety in kids, and we know now much more than we ever knew before that are about non-drug options for anxiety. And so I think that's a very hopeful message. And the term that parents might be looking for is cognitive behavioral treatments. Those are treatments where we're, helping teach kids some skills and parents some skills for really targeting like changing kids' thoughts, especially thoughts that are negative or that only really lead to us feeling more anxious. They also target feelings, and just as Jill mentioned, like those baby steps that you want to enter new situations. Our treatments help parents to know, how do I structure those baby steps? When do I give rewards? High fives as they go through it? How fast is too fast to go through? How much do I push? All those kinds of questions are usually addressed in treatment. And then we also kind of teach them how to recognize these feelings in their body, also understanding what they are, even just understanding what anxiety is, why some of it is helpful, and exactly what's happening, and in a very simple, easy to understand way. And we'll describe that to kids, sometimes even drawing it out for them, exactly what the fight or flight system looks like. And some kids actually say, you know what, after session 1, I already feel a little better just knowing what this is, knowing that I'm not different than other kids. So there are ways that we can make it more palatable or fun where you don't feel like you're in therapy. So I think those are just a summary of some of the skills-based treatments that I think parents could look for. And the nice thing is that kids tend to respond pretty quickly.
Before we move on to Jill, I had to write down the marking time before. Does it look like they're marking time before they leave? That's a great phrase. And I felt like it just described me at every party that I've been to, like marking time before I leave. That's excellent. Thank you. Okay.
I feel like that's my number one fear. Yeah, I think that Donna summarized it beautifully. And so I don't have a ton to add. I will just say that I think that it's really important as parents to be careful consumers of what kind of therapy approaches that you're looking for. And Donna rightly said, make sure you're looking for something that might look like cognitive behavior therapy. There are other things like acceptance and commitment therapy or other sort of behavior modification approaches that are similar to that. And so it does come in some other different labels or forms. But it's not like every psychologist really, or every therapist or every counselor is really clear all the time on the type of model of therapy that they use. So I think it's really important that parents ask questions about the science behind the work that somebody is providing, because, the therapies for anxiety are like one of like the really big good news stories in psychology. Mm-hmm. They work well, they work fast, they produce a pretty substantial response for a lot of kids. Now, not every kid, but for most kids. And so if you're not getting that kind of effective skills package of some sort from your clinician, it might be time to kind of think about who else could do that for you.
That's a great point.
Great reminders.
Absolutely. Careful consumers. I like that. And I think that will be helpful to parents. I think this whole discussion will be extremely helpful to parents. We're so happy and grateful that you joined us today to talk about fear and anxiety in kids and teens and especially as we start to, open things back up in a lot of places. And we hear again from so many parents who are experiencing challenges with this. So we just want to thank you so much for your time and joining us.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. Make sure to hit follow or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever platform you're listening on to be notified of future episodes. We'd also love to connect with you on social media. Look for our blue and yellow logo when you search Pandemic Parenting on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or YouTube, and you'll find us. Or follow the links in the show notes. Let us know what you think of this episode by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Your 5-star review helps us move up the charts to reach even more parents and caregivers. If you have a specific question or topic you'd like us to address in a future episode, let us know. You can email info@pandemic-parent.org and mention podcast in the subject line. And this podcast isn't all we do, by the way. Pandemic Parenting is a 501c3 nonprofit providing free science-based resources for parents and all who care for children while navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. To learn more about our organization and access our extensive library of webinars, videos, blogs, and more, visit www.pandemic-parent.org. Lastly, this show wouldn't be possible without supporters like you. Lindsay and I donate our time to this podcast, but we do have an incredible team working behind the scenes to make this all happen. If you'd like to support the show beyond leaving your 5-star review, visit www.pandemic-parent.org/support and donate today. Listening. Hope you can join us next time.